Hi, my name is Jed Larson. I'm an 8th grade U.S. history teacher at Kit Carson International Academy in Sacramento, California. In November of 2021, I had the privilege of interviewing Dr. Rose Borunda, a CapEd faculty fellow at Sacramento State University, author of What is the Color of Your Heart and a member of the Purepecha tribe. We talked about the ways stories and histories of Native Americans have been told in this country, in the United States. This video includes most of our conversation. Please see the description below the video to access different parts of our conversation. In an 1830 speech to Congress, President Andrew Jackson stated the policies and attitudes towards Native Americans that underscored the justification for removing Native Americans to Western territories. He framed his position using racial terms and by describing multiple times how the, quote, red men would be replaced by settlements of whites. Referring to Native Americans 4 times as savage, he suggested that their numbers were small and that they would be replaced by millions filled with all the blessings of liberty, civilization, and religion. Yet, Jackson attempted to promote his position as though he were extending generosity to Native Americans who, he indicated, would experience utter annihilation. If they were not removed. In his pitch, he expressed that the United States kindly offers them a new home and proposes to pay the whole expense of their removal and settlement. The US was offering to save the Native Americans from the United States. Dr. Borunda, was Andrew Jackson, the president at the time, the first person to tell this kind of story about Native Americans?
Not at all, Mr. Larson, but what I want to address is this is a perfect example of the use of messaging. Messaging in order to manipulate, messaging in order to justify the aggression, the violence, and the exploitation that was going to take place. So it's important for us to look at this messaging because it continues over time. So for example, let's take a look at first that he indicated that the number of Native American people here in what we call the United States was small. It was in the millions, okay? But the people coming from across the Atlantic fleeing conditions there were in the millions. So in that proportionality, minimizing the number of Native American people already living on this land. In addition to that, referring to Native American people as savages. So there's a dehumanizing aspect to that in which there's a minimizing of their humanity and also uplifting those that are coming here as though they are more deserving. But he wasn't the first. We recognize that Columbus, when he came and encountered the Taino and the Arawak people on their homelands. And at first, and I'll quote some of the terms that Columbus used to describe the Taino people. He said they were well-built, quick intelligence, very good customs. But when he couldn't extract the gold and what he needed to pay his expedition, pay back Queen Isabella of Spain, suddenly his attitude changed. And this is what we talk about in terms of cognitive dissonance. Suddenly he started referring to the Taino and the Arawak people as cruel, as stupid, a people warlike and numerous. And this next part is key, whose customs and religion are very different from ours. And with that, the sense that we live in a diverse world where there is no one group of people who have the monopoly on beliefs, on traditions, on religion. So now to elevate himself and his own way of thinking and being over somebody who is, quote, different from him, starts to set the standard, at least here in the Americas. So with that, he started the cross-Atlantic slave trade. So remember the messaging, the justification, the use of that messaging to manipulate, and then to use that against others so he could use aggression, violence, and exploitation. Not everybody, fortunately, has that way of thinking. And we were fortunate that at that time, what was chronicled, for example, the Spaniard Bartolome de las Casas, he witnessed in one afternoon the murder of 3,000 people on the Cuban island, including women and children killed by the Spaniards. And he reported that and spoke to the atrocities and spoke against them. We can move forward and we can see the Franciscan priest, Bernardino Sahagún. And what he did was understanding what we have in terms of what's called culture side. So that what was happening was the annihilation of ways of being, of ways of thinking, of ways of speaking, in which were now being eliminated by cultural invasion. So this priest sought out to learn the Nahuatl language and chronicled the petroglyphs and hieroglyphs and learned as much as he could from a people who were experiencing culture side. So the Spaniards, like Jackson, were seeking to control the messaging so that they could justify what they were going to do to people already living here on the Americas for thousands upon thousands of years.
Dr. Borunda, how did British colonists continue this kind of storytelling?
Yes, it was unfortunate because when you look at what started to happen here in what we call the United States now, that this messaging of people who were already here and the people who were brought in chains now were continued to be displaced, exploited, and then genocide, all taking place. Yet, those who came as colonizers turned around and accusing the British of oppressing them and that the British were impeding on their human rights. So it was interesting that a people who have experienced their own oppression turn around and use that on others. So by defining who is human, by minimizing the humanity of others, they too followed in the same line of thinking of Columbus, the Spanish, the British, and the United States, of who has rights and who doesn't have rights, by determining pretty much who's human and who isn't human.
Dr. Brunda, here's our next question. President Jackson argued for removal, but he implied that if Native Americans weren't removed, they would be annihilated. Did the United States ever change its policy from forced removal and annihilation to something else?
Well, as Helen Hunt Jackson chronicled in her Century of Dishonor, what she looked at is how then violence, aggression was employed against Native American people. And as we saw across the Americas from different European nations. So what we saw was, when I talked about culture side, we saw the boarding schools that were opened up. And in these boarding schools, what was taught to Native American children was that their cultures were to be annihilated. But then they were also taught that white Christian values were to be upheld and adopted. So there was a forced assimilation that was happening at that time. So when we look at for example, Colonel Richard Pratt, he was a founder of the first boarding school. He was looking at kill the Indian, save the man. And what does that mean when you're trying to strip somebody of who they are? And you can hear that now in the rhetoric when people talk about teaching tolerance. Nobody wants to be tolerated, but let's accept different ways of thinking and being and appreciation of one another. And unfortunately, through this assimilation process, there's a real disadvantage with white children who are brought up into this sort of thinking that everybody else has to become something that they're not, rather than being able to acculturate and learn to walk in different worlds. The rest of the world does not think in that Eurocentric way. So we disadvantage all children in that form of thinking of assimilationist theory.
Historian James Lowen states that historically, American Indians have been the most lied about subset of our population. In the 21st century, we would think that we are speaking truth to our students in our classrooms. Is his statement accurate?
Absolutely. And I've been a fan of James Lowen since I first read his book, Lies My Teacher Told Me. Understanding the importance of words have power. So when you look at the whole doctrine of discovery, it's a sense that nothing was here And here I am communicating with you from the land of the Sierra Miwok, that they weren't here until they were discovered. That doesn't make any sense. So what was here before Columbus stumbled upon the Americas, and how we come to bring that back to the forefront so we can all appreciate what was here and what we can learn from those diverse cultures. The other part of this is not just a doctrine of discovery, but even using terms like New World. I tend to bristle when I hear that word, because there's no way in which you can have this part of the world be brand new and that other part of the world being old. There are histories from this land, just as there are histories from the European continent as well. So again, there's a perpetuation and indoctrination of white supremacy that's being perpetuated here. So when we look at continuing to use that sort of terminology, we don't open up the discussion to look at other names that were here long before this was called America, whether it was called Turtle Island, whether it was called Aslan. There were other terms that were used and are still employed by the people that have lived here for thousands of years.
Dr. Borunda, we've talked about the stories told by European colonizers and the United States. What about stories and perspectives of Native Americans from the last 530 years?
You know, there's multiple ways in which to chronicle history, and also different perspectives. We've often been exposed to what's called the master narrative, and that's who controls the pen, which gets into our history books. However, there are oral traditions that have been passed down. And I can tell you, as living here in the Sierra foothills here in Miwok territory, that from where I'm sitting, I could see a hill that when you go to the top of the hill, you look over to the hills that buttress right against the ocean, seen from San Francisco all the way through the wine country. But where you're sitting right now, Mr. Larson, you're in Sacramento, that was all covered by water. That was a body of water. So the people from here would cross over on boats going back and forth. And what they saw was Batista. When Batista was coming up, the Spaniard, and they're establishing their missions and trying to establish their dominion over the California region, as the Russians and other people were starting to come into this part of the world as well. So what was chronicled here, and we have a slide that shows you that you can also put your history on rocks. So what you see in this image is an image of a Native American looking down on Juan Bautista. Now look at the positionality of this image. And so you have the Native American up on top. So that shows positionality of being up on a hill. Bautista couldn't get himself up here. He had horses, he had wagons, and they didn't have the sort of canoes or anything that could come on water to get up to this area. They wanted to, but they couldn't make it. Yet you see Bautista, you see his back is turned to the hills because he is now at a distance away. But in addition to being able to engrave that in rock, we also have what we call rock mill, where I can make an image of a Spaniard and then send it to the next tribe up the way and say, this is who's coming. This is what they look like. And this is what we see that's happening. Watch out. So, you know, we have email. There was also rock mail in which tribes were communicating up and down the Americas. So other ways in which history was chronicled. And we have those stories. We have that information. If we could only share it with our youth so they understand multiple perspectives of what was going on.
Dr. Borunda, we often talk about Native Americans as if they were submissive, weak, and easily conquered by superior European forces. Are there stories of Native American resistance that do not get told that should get told?
Oh, absolutely. And well, you know, there's volumes written about the resistance. We're just going to show images, and I would leave it to students to go and explore these stories. So for example, in Peru, you have the Incas, and here you have this incredible image of an Inca warrior. And what does this mean to the people in Peru, when they see this sort of resistance taking place. In Mexico, we had the Mexica tribe, who also known as the Aztec, who they themselves received the Spaniards into their homes and gave them a place to stay. And without any provocation, the Spaniards decided that they would start fighting against. It was already planned. So here we have the Mexica having to fight back. And then the Purepecha, which is my tribe. These are people that are very unique in the region now called Mexico. And you see here Princess Herendira, who her father was killed, and even our own tribal people fighting against one another and not knowing how to respond to this conquest that was coming. Do you give in? Do you try to ally yourself? And she herself was able to capture one of the horses. They're called Lipizzan horses that were brought from Europe, and these were essentially the equivalent of a tank. Okay, and she was able to use it and ride against the Spaniards themselves, and even parts of her tribe that aligned themselves with the Spaniards. Also, the Cascans, and here you have an image of a leader of the Cascan people, a whole other story conveyed about the resistance here in the Americas. And then the Pueblo people of the Southwest and what they did when they had this sense of domination and oppression coming upon them and said, no, we're not going to tolerate this anymore. So there's multiple stories that are written and chronicled about resistance. However, what you'll often hear, because of the messaging, is a sense of these people were savages. Yet the battles were not initiated by the people of this land. And so there were certain alliances that were taking place amongst some Native American tribes. However, the response to what was coming to them, there was something that was beyond their understanding, particularly when you had weapons such as smallpox coming at them. And you had whole groups of thousands and thousands of people dying from illnesses in which there was no immunity. And here in California, we can also look at, when you look at what happened at Mission San Diego del Cala, the Kumeyaay people revolted. And they, also in resistance, also the story of Toyperina of the Tangwa people, and what she did, leading her people also in resistance to Spanish incursion upon their land.
Dr. Borunda, if you could design part of the 8th grade curriculum for U.S. history, what would you design?
Yeah, and in my teaching multiculturalism in the post-secondary settings, there's been 2 areas of deficit that I've identified. One, the voices that are excluded totally, being from those populations that are marginalized. And so one of the efforts in working with people in academia is the inclusion of California Indian vetted curriculum, in which we're able to learn from the people who were already here. What is your understanding? What happened? And hearing the truth from their perspective. And this is not just for California, but across the nation itself. And even understanding the beautiful story of how the Iroquois gave us democracy. That when you have a people that came from Europe and, they themselves were escaping mistreatment of themselves. So, why would so many people come here unless they were escaping something and having nothing assured that they would be able to plant themselves in a way that assured their survival? So the assistance of Native Americans in helping to organize them by providing democracy, yet we know that there were certain elements of democracy that the Iroquois gave us that were taken out. And much of it had to do of equity, which we're still fighting with that sense of equity itself. So inclusion of other voices, California Indian, as well as all the other histories that make up this diverse nation. The second element that I've uncovered that's missing from our curriculum are the voices of Euro-Americans themselves, who have opposed the voices of people like Andrew Jackson, which is what we opened with. Not every white American has been out to exploit has been out to commit genocide, has been out to displace people here on this land. So when we talk about people like Catherine Weldon, we talk about people like Helen Hunt Jackson and Angelina Grimke, we talk about white people who, even in the 1800s, were in opposition of the policies and practices that brought us slavery and racialized slavery and the displacement and genocide of Native Americans, and then later the exploitation of people coming from the Asian continent. And we could go on to the exploitation of people who are considered, quote, different, right? And we've already talked about that. So in that sense, that if we're gonna look to advantage our students, all students, I would like our white students to be able to see themselves more than just in that category of white supremacists who see their culture as the culture that is the one to follow. That excludes so many people and excludes them from being able to engage in a holistic manner with the rest of the world, let alone with people here in the United States. So if we're going to be able to move forward as a nation, how do we include marginalized voices, which also includes white Americans who have acted to try to create a more equitable, a more caring, a more loving place to be. So those are the two areas that I would love to see take place.
Dr. Borunda, in your book, What is the Color of Your Heart? You write about people being able to see the humanity in others who have often been dehumanized. Can you tell us a little bit about that, please?
Yeah, it's and we look across history that we tend to focus on we tend to sanitize, Juniper Serra, we sanitize Andrew Jackson, but yet people know what happened, and then with people who have been subjected to those policies and the aggression and the violence, the curriculum becomes in and of itself violent to have to learn. So when you look at people like Standing Bear, the Ponkas, who went to Boston and engaged people like Helen Hunt Jackson, who said, wait a minute, I didn't know this was going on. And now that I know this is going on, that your people are being displaced and the United States government is not acting in good faith, we need to do something about this. And she did. She wrote Century of Dishonor. When we look at people like Catherine Weldon, who went to by the side of Sitting Bull, whose people were being starved, people were being manipulated. He was a leader of the Hunkpapa Lakota people, and looking at how she could advise them and being able to speak to what was happening at that time. So again, bearing witness to what is happening and looking at how we're able to then magnify and amplify those voices. So those are just two examples, Catherine Weldon and Helen Hunt Jackson, for us to be able to look at what do we have to learn from people like these two individuals, just like, we look at Angelina Grimke and other people from the abolitionist movement.
Dr. Borunda, it's been a pleasure talking with you today. Thank you so much for your insights and expertise in all of the areas that we discussed. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Larson. Appreciate being here.